Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think we want to start on time today because we have quite a few papers, and we hope to have a robust discussion at the end. I'm John Lapinski, and I am Director of Elections at NBC News, as well as the Data Analytics Lab, and I'm a professor at Penn, and I run a center there, Penn's program for opinion research and election studies. I want to say that everybody here, Courtney Kennedy, who will be our discussant, is going to introduce most of the panelists, but we're delighted to be here today. Those of you who know me, this is my delighted face. So I'm trying my best. I think everybody, again, that knows me knows that that is the case. But today's panel is going to be the accomplishments and challenges of the exit poll. And the panel really is about sharing the research that we've been engaged in to continue to improve upon the exit poll. And the National Election Exit Poll is unique, and we'll talk about many of the innovations that we have introduced, which we believe will maintain the exit poll as the gold standard of election research. Our research today also will show our commitment to the complete transparency of the exit poll. As most of you know in the audience, we've deposited decades worth of exit polls at the Roper Center, and I just talked to Joe Lenski, who has assured me that we'll be up to date through 2018, probably sometime early next week. But again, even though that we want to be completely transparent, we also this panel, we hope today, will show that we're really have a commitment to bringing the best talent possible to dealing with some of the difficult issues we all face in doing election polling. Some of these issues are actually go beyond the exit poll and just deal with sort of issues that we all, as sort of professional pollsters, deal with doing election polling. I want to point out that I view this as a collective effort. I think that the exit poll is very important. It has a long history, which some of the panelists will talk about. And that history means that the exit poll, even though the networks use it on election night to sort of tell the story of elections, it goes well beyond that. There's a lot of people that use the exit poll, a wide range of academics, the people in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, people for political parties. It really, again, the exit poll is a lot more than just about sort of election night. And in talking about the collective spirit of this effort, what you'll see today is, this is the research of probably about a dozen people or so. And these are people that are what I consider to be some of the best talent in the business, that deal with these issues. And it's going to be a continuing effort. So I want everybody to know that we're all researchers. And from the center that I run at Penn, we're going to be creating we've created a large number of sort of working groups, and we're going to continue to innovate. And what we want to do again today is show you some of the fruits of that effort. So not to take too much time, because I want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A at the end, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, and that's the only panelist that I will introduce. He's Josh Clinton. He's a professor at Vanderbilt University. He also runs a center there, and he's been a senior member of my decision desk at NBC News for quite some time. Josh and I actually we knew each other before this, but we had our first sort of professional experience in 2000 at the AAPOR, at the AAPOR conference in Portland, when it was Doug Rivers and George Training battling each other. So in any case, I'm going to introduce Josh. He's going to do a paper that's an advantage of the exit poll, leveraging precincts. Even though Josh is doing the presenting, myself, Mark Meredith, who's a professor at Penn and also works at NBC News, Stephen Pettigrew of Penn and NBC News, and Charlie Riemann of NBC News are also contributors, and actually other people than that too. So I don't want to actually shortchange anybody who's contributed to the research, but I'll hand it off to you, Josh, and we'll begin.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to talk about my presentation, one aspect of the exit poll that may not be widely appreciated, but I think is really, really critical for understanding why the exit poll is such a powerful analytical tool. So we all know trying to do pre-election polling, that is really, really hard, right? That's to state the obvious. So pre-election polling, right, we face at least two tasks, right? Which are the respondents that we get to answer our surveys are actually voters, right? And so we know that people, have social desirability bias. We know that past voting behavior is not always predictive of future behavior, and so that makes things complicated. But then we also have the problem of non-response, right? So the voters that we are talking to, how do they relate to the set of voters who we are not talking to, right? So we need to know both of those kind of puzzles to try to figure out an accurate assessment of who's voting and kind of what their opinions are. So the exit poll is arguably beneficial because we can escape the first problem, right? We're talking in the in-person exit polls, we're talking to known voters, and so the only kind of task that we have is the task that we also share with pre-election polling is, well, how do the voters that we're talking to that are known compare to the voters who we're not talking to, right? Which is obviously a task that all surveying kind of faces. So one thing that the exit polls do is that we have exit poll precincts that give us actual data on this that we can leverage in real time to account for this non-response. So not only are we talking to known voters, so we don't have to make any estimates of who actually votes or not, but we also know something about where they're coming from. And so we carefully select precincts in each state to be representative of the overall state. So that's really important because we know where the voters are coming from in terms of their precincts. We know the precinct demographics, right? So we can see if there's differences in terms of where they're coming from. We know the past voting behavior of the precincts where we're talking to the voters. Moreover, we know the interviewers' characteristics. So if we're concerned about interviewer effects, as sometimes we are, we can kind of see if there's differences based on gender, age, race, or any others factors that people hypothesize that might influence your results. And then for each precinct, critically, right, whenever we get an exit poll response, we also get the current ballots that are being counted at precinct for most of the precincts. Right? So not only do we have the exit poll responses, but we also know how that compares directly to the number of ballots that are cast at that particular precinct. Now, if you just think about that, that's an amazing amount of data. Right? So we have the actual truth at each precinct about how many votes are cast. We know what our sample of voters looks like. And we know how the precincts compare and differ from one another across precincts. And we also know something about the interviewers themselves. So that's a tremendous amount of data that we're able to leverage to kind of figure out, if there's non-response, what's that correlated with, right? And then consequently, how can we use that to maybe adjust our estimates to account for the fact that we know that not every voter, is equally likely to take a survey. So is this unique to the exit poll? Well, in some ways, critically, yes, right? So in principle, you could do this, right, by thinking about how your results from any survey compare to the election results, but that's really hard, especially early on when it's most critical. So we all know, right, that early vote returns are not representative of the overall, right? So if you think about Virginia, it's historically horrible. It's not horrible. The vote comes out, it's not a representative sample of the final vote, shall we say, right, to be more precise. And so if you're trying to wait to the early election votes, that's difficult, right? In order to do that, then you need to kind of build in modeling assumptions that are untestable on election day. Right? And so, or otherwise you need to have some kind of, post-stratification or try to make a guess as to what the electorate looks like. That could be wildly off and there's no way to correct that in real time, right? Until we get lots of data. Now at the end of the night, right, when all the data rolls in, right, then you can characterize that. But at that point, it's probably, then we have the actual vote that's coming in. And so that's not as useful. So the critical thing is what we have early on. And the exit poll, the precincts here give us amazing leverage on this, right? Because at each point, we have how our sample of exit poll responses compare to all the votes that have been cast in the precinct at that time, right? And so that's we actually know what the truth is, which is rare, right? And then we know what our sample looks like compared to that. And so that gives us really powerful leverage. So just kind of give you some sense of what that looks like, right, or kind of what that looked like in 2018. So this is just talking about in-person exit polls, right? So this is the number of kind of states that we exit polled in. So we had 631 in-person exit poll precincts around the country, and we talked about 52,000 people in person, what's going on there, and so. So we're talking to a lot of actual voters. We don't need to estimate that. So now the question is, how do the people that we're talking to compare, right, to what the ballots were actually cast there? And so what this shows you here, so this is raw, right? This is just raw, unweighted, actual data. And what this is showing you is that precinct by precinct, so each point here is a precinct, right? Every precinct has at least 15 respondents, and it's comparing what the answers in the precinct were to the actual truth in terms of the truth in that precinct, the number of ballots that were cast. And so, these are samples, right? So this doesn't plot the confidence intervals, but when you put 95% confidence intervals, because some of these only have 15 respondents in it, so that confidence interval is ginormous. So 75% of our exit poll precincts unweighted, contain the actual, the truth in terms of what the percentage was, right? Unweighted data. And this also includes some really strong warts. So for example, we had difficulty in West Virginia, right? They would not let our exit poll interviewers get kind of close to the polling place, and so that ended up in court. So there's warts there, right? So there's always kind of issues, and there you go. But still, in the raw, unweighted, 75% contain the truth, right? Which is kind of remarkable just in the raw data. So that's for the governor races. For the Senate races, right? Similar story, right? 77% of the precincts, the raw exit poll responses had estimated, an estimate of kind of the candidate support that overlapped the true number of ballots cast in those precincts, right? So that's just in the raw data, no weighting, right? Just kind of adding up. So of course we weight, right? That's what you do. But even before that, like if we just aggregate that to the state level, again, raw, unweighted data, no weights at the state level, and this is for the Senate races, the governor tells you the same thing, right? Really high correlation between the votes that are cast in those precincts, right? Summed up the state. So this is not the statewide estimates, these are just the number of votes cast in the precincts. And so you can see that there's 3 states where the raw data is wrong, right? Ohio, Nevada, and Missouri. Right? Indiana, Tennessee, and Florida are basically 50%. They're kind of like 50-50. So that's kind of like toss up indeterminate. But like in general, right? The raw data, unadjusted, it does a really, really remarkable job matching up the votes that are being cast in those particular precincts. Okay. So, but of course, we're not complete. We also weight the data. Right, so let's show you what that looks like at 5 p.m. So again, this is 5 p.m. data. There are still more responses coming in. So this is a partial accounting. And so the weighting that we're doing here is only based on education, age, race, and gender, right? With some kind of non-response correction, right? And so what that shows you, so here's the true estimate. Not the estimate. This is what actually happened in the election statewide, the final with certified results. And so at 5 p.m. using the 5 p.m. data, right? And those estimates, so critically we are not weighting, right, to the result, right? Because that would be 100% accurate, but not very informative. So this is at 5 p.m., so still early data, weighting to those targets, and what you see is that there's never a mistake, right, at 5 p.m. So there's some states that are too close to call, right? Ohio, Florida, and Georgia, right? The 95% confidence intervals overlap 0, so there's no difference, so you'd never make any kind of call there. You'd actually wait for data. But in general, whenever the results are statistically distinguishable from 0, i.e. there's a margin that's statistically significant, it's in the right direction, right? And the correlation between our estimated votes at 5 p.m. weighted and the actual true result at the end when it's all certified is like 0.986, right? Which you round up as 0.99, which, is pretty good for social science, right? And then if you do the Senate, right, you get the similar picture, right? So here's just, again, the actual end of the certified results, right? And now let's compare what the weighted results look like at 5 p.m., right? Slightly lower correlation, right? It's not exactly linear, which is what correlation is measuring. But if you look at the confidence intervals, right? And whenever those confidence intervals are distinguishable from 0, i.e. that you would be confident that there is one candidate significantly in advance of the others, right? It's correct. Right? Now, sometimes you can't be confident, and so it's too close. So in Indiana, Missouri, Texas, Florida, Mississippi, Arizona, West Virginia, right? The exit poll data was basically, the 95% confidence interval say, well, we need to wait and see, right? You never kind of make a call based on that. So once again, whenever the results are statistically distinguishable from 0, right? It's in the right direction, which is critical. So just to kind of conclude, I think one really important part about the exit poll is the fact that we do have these exit poll precincts. And that's really super important because it gives us actual data on election day about how our poll responses compare to actual votes being cast. We don't need to make assumptions. We can actually just look at the data and see how are they different. And if they're different, what might correlate with those differences in ways that allows us to adjust for those particular differences, whether that be interviewer effects, whether that be precinct events, whether that be kind of the voters that we're talking to versus the voters who are walking by and won't take the exit poll survey. We know something about them, right? So that's really critical because otherwise, you can get this right with assumptions and using past data, but the problem is, as we found out in 2016 when state pre-election polls, is that you're right until you're not, right? And so the critical thing about exit poll precincts is that it gives you real-time data that you don't need to make assumptions about, that you can actually quantify how well are we doing, right? And is there a systematic pattern to the responses that we have compared to the votes that are being recorded in ways that we can then adjust that in real time, right? Which is absolutely, fundamental. More importantly, yes, we do weighting, but even in the raw, it's remarkably good, right? Whenever we have a statistically significant effect in terms of a difference between candidates, it's always in the right direction. Now, some of them we can't make that claim, right? They're indistinguishable from zero in terms of the difference, but that's okay, right? That's statistics. And at least it kind of gives us that information so we know when we're confident and when we're not confident. And at least in 2018, whenever we were confident, it was always in the right direction, right? So weighting does help that. And then moreover, even at 5 p.m., right? So before the polls close, before we get all the data, right? Just using and before we even kind of wait to the actual vote itself, right? Our results kind of closely match the final outcome, which is kind of, again, reassuring. So I think the fact that we have the actual data from precincts that are representative of the state, and we know how that data compares to the responses that we're getting is really, really important, because it means that we can use data, not assumptions, to make sure that we're kind of getting as close as we can to the truth. Because every survey is a survey, right? And so there's always going to be problems, right? And so this at least gives us some way to calibrate that using ground truth for a representative sample of the precincts. And I think that's a really important and underappreciated aspect that gives us powerful leverage to try to figure out, if there is non-response, how it can be corrected for and accounted for in the estimates that are done. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Josh. Next, we have a presentation from Edison Research, which conducts all exit polls for the major news organizations comprising the national election pool. To present, we have Joe Lenski, co-founder and executive vice president of Edison Research.
Thank you, Courtney. Thanks for being here, and thanks to all the people watching on the World Wide Web. We're very happy to be part of that experiment that AAPOR is doing to bring this presentation to people around the country and around the world. What I'm going to be talking about is a very small part of the changes we made to talk to early voters this year. In the growth of early vote has always been a challenge for exit polling, and as of 2016 and 2018, about 40% of votes cast in elections nationwide are cast before Election Day. All the benefits that Josh just talked about in terms of talking to voters after they voted are limited to, or have been limited for us, to people we can talk to on Election Day. What we decided this year in 2 states is to use the same exit polling methodology, but to approach early voters after they voted early before Election Day. And the 2 states we chose were Nevada and Tennessee. And the reason we chose Nevada and Tennessee is they are states with high proportions of early voter. Over 60% of votes in both states are cast before Election Day. But the critical factor is those early votes are predominantly cast in person at early voter locations. More than 80 to 90% of votes cast early in Nevada and Tennessee are cast in person compared to by mail. And they both had competitive Senate and governor races in 2018. I'm just putting this up here to show the sampling frame that we were able to use. And what we have in both states are a finite number of early voter locations. In Nevada, there were 137. In Tennessee, there were 158. And we know a lot of critical information about these locations. We know where they're located. We know when the voting period is. We know the hours in which people are eligible to vote. So that is our sample frame when we can pick the locations in which we ended up interviewing. In both states, we chose 20 locations, and the population we used was all the locations except the really tiny locations where fewer than 50 to 100 people would be voting on an election day, and that in Nevada accounted for about 4%, so there's about 4% non-coverage by excluding the small locations. But otherwise, every location was included. We stratified by geographic region. We also ordered by past party vote. And then where we had this information, we had estimated number of early voters based on past history in Nevada, or at least by county in Tennessee. So we chose the 20 locations to represent the spread geographically and based on the past voting history. And then once we picked the locations, we randomly assigned hours of interviewing over the 10-day or 2-week period in which early voting occurred in each of those states. So we had coverage in terms of by day and by hour randomly across the state, because we know different voters vote early in the process and different voters vote late in the early voting process, and we want to make sure we covered all of them. So that's the sampling frame here. The approach to voters is very similar to the approach we have on election day. We had an interviewer stationed outside the early voting location, and as a voter leaves, they were approached by our interviewer. In this case, as opposed to election day, which we still conduct 100% on paper, we had interviewers using both iPads and paper questionnaires. And as we also do on election day, we recorded non-response people who refused to take the survey. We recorded age, race, and gender of those that refused, and we could adjust for non-response by those demographics. So here are the results. In Nevada, we interviewed over 1,550 early voters between October 25th and November 3rd. We had a 36% response rate, which is similar, just a little bit less than our national response rate on election day, which is about 43%. And in Nevada, 72% of the interviews were conducted using paper, 28% on the iPads. In Tennessee, we interviewed over 2,000 early voters they have a slightly longer early voting period from October 18th to November 1st. We had a similar response rate, 37%, and slightly more of the Tennessee voters selected to take the survey on the iPad on paper. These are very high sample sizes compared to the types of sample sizes we can get by telephone calling early voters. And not only do we have larger sample sizes, a much more cost-effective way to reach these folks, because we have one interviewer basically able to interview 50 to 100 people at each location, as opposed to a telephone survey. And we've seen in other presentations here that if we can get 1.3 completes per hour, that's per interviewer hour, that's a phenomenal telephone rate. Here, at least we were doing, in some cases, 5 to 10 times that number of completions per interview using this technique. So how did the results look? They looked very good for us. This is comparing the actual early vote in both states for Senate and governor in Nevada and Tennessee with the results from our survey of early voters. So this isn't the statewide total number, this is the statewide early vote number in both Nevada and Tennessee. And as you can see, in Nevada, we were dead on the Senate race and off by 1 point for each candidate in the governor's race. In Tennessee, we were dead on the Senate race and off by 3 points on the Democrat, 1 point on the Republican. But basically, we had a survey that represented very accurately the actual results of early voting in both those states. Now, to get to this result, as I said, we did a non-response adjustment based on the observed non-response by age, by gender, and by race. And we also did an adjustment for non-response based on college education, which was the same response we used on election day this year, and that'll be talked about in one of the future following presentations today. So, in conclusion, we were able to use the same techniques that we use on election day to actually talk to actual voters as they left early voter locations in both Nevada and Tennessee, and we were very happy with those results, and we're probably going to use this technique in more states in 2020. We were able to get much higher response rates with our in-person surveys than you can get with a telephone survey or online survey. And as I said, because a single interviewer can do as many as 50 or 100 interviews in one day, as opposed to the yield you usually get on telephone surveys, we were able to get much higher sample sizes of actual voters than we could using a telephone survey approach for early voters. And because we're talking to actual voters, because we saw them leave the early voting location, we know they're actual voters, so we don't have to deal with any likely voter models or self-reported screens on voting. So we think this is a particularly effective way to use the same exit polling techniques of interviewing actual voters that we've been using for over 40 years and apply them to this issue of early voting, especially in states with high proportion of early voting where that proportion is done in person as opposed to by mail. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Dan Merkle, who is AAPOR President-elect and Executive Director of Elections for ABC News.
All right, how do I put this in slide mode? Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. Happy to be here. So my presentation today focuses on improvements made to the National Election Pool exit poll weighting procedures for the 2018 election. We'll talk about three main things. First of all, what was done. Secondly, how well did it work? And then third, what are the implications for exit poll trend? In other words, given the new weighting procedures, can we still make comparisons to past exit poll data? So the revised weighting approach was a joint effort between Edison Research, who conducts the exit poll, and the NEP Steering Committee, which oversees the National Election Pool. And that's made up of representatives from the four networks, ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. Just a shout out to Edison, Joe and his great team. They did all the heavy lifting in terms of the evaluation research that went into this, all the simulations that we did, and then obviously the programming and the implementation and the testing for 2018. So before 2018, the weighting adjustments, in addition to the sampling weights, included two main adjustments. The first is a age, race, sex adjustment. That's a non-response adjustment, and that is based on interviewer observations of these characteristics. And secondly, the exit poll, the vote in the exit poll is forced or weighted to the actual vote ultimately at the end of election night. But on election day, it's weighted to our best estimate of what that vote will be throughout the night on election day. So as we all know, education played a particularly important role in the 2016 elections, both in terms of the analysis of the outcome of the election, but then also in terms of the evaluation of the performance of the pre-election polls after 2016. So for example, AAPOR's ad hoc committee on the 2016 pre-election polls that Courtney chaired concluded that adjusting for the overrepresentation of college graduates was critical, but many pre-election polls did not do that. And similarly, like many pre-election polls, the exit poll at that time and previously had not adjusted for education. The weighting of the exit poll is fairly straightforward for age, race, and sex. Like I said, it's based on interviewer observation, but education is not observable in the same way. Last year, Gary Langer and colleagues published a piece in POQ I thought was very well done. But one aspect of it is that they did comparisons of the exit poll to other surveys for the demographics. And one thing that was highlighted in the article is that education and age, there was a mismatch between the exit poll and some other high-quality surveys. So what they did is they looked at the election demographics in 2016, comparing the exit poll to the ABC post poll using Mr. P, and then also comparing to the CPS voter supplement. And what the article found was that CPS and the ABC post estimates were quite consistent, but comparing these to the exit poll, they found significant differences for education and age. So for example, 40% in the ABC post poll and in the CPS were college graduates compared to 50% in the exit poll, and about a quarter in the ABC post poll and in CPS were age 65 plus, and that was 16% in the exit poll. So in an effort to refine and improve the weighting in the exit poll for 2018, Edison did a deep dive comparing education and age in the exit poll to the CPS voting supplement across, nationally and across all the states, so over various election years. And they found a fairly consistent understatement of age in the exit poll, overstatement of education, like I mentioned, and it didn't vary much over time. And so further for education, they found that the overstatement of the percentage of college-educated voters was more pronounced among non-white voters than it was among white voters. So for the weighting in 2018, Edison added an adjustment to the exit poll data that uses a ratio of the past CPS percent over the past exit poll percent for the age and education categories that you see on the right side of the screen there. So these weighting adjustments on the right side were added to the existing weighting adjustments that you see on the left side of the screen there. At the same time that we were looking to improve the education weighting, we also wanted to take a fresh look at the education question that we used on the exit poll, specifically the question wording and the question placement, and we identified a few improvements there, which I'll just mention briefly. So on the left side of the screen, you can see the question that we used prior to 2018, and on the right side is the new question wording we used in 2018. The new question wording takes up a few more lines, and space on the exit poll, it's at a premium, but we felt it was important to make this adjustment because we felt it improved the data. So the main change in the question wording is that we split out the some college and associate's degree category. It was one response item previously, we split it into two. And then we also made the postgraduate category at the same time both more restrictive but also more specific in terms of what we were asking for. And in some testing we did after 2016, we found that these changes help respondents more accurately classify themselves in terms of education. And then secondly, in terms of the questionnaire placement, prior to 2018, the education question was on the back side of the questionnaire. We decided for 2018 and beyond to ask it on the front side of the questionnaire wherever possible, because some research we did in 2016, after 2016, found that voters with less education were more likely to skip the back side of the questionnaire. So anyway, getting back to the weighting and answering the question, how well did it work? One way to get at this is to do something like Gary Langer and colleagues did, which is to compare the exit poll to other high-quality surveys to see how well the results line up. So in my presentation, I do this by comparing the exit poll to the final ABC Post pre-election poll, and then Stephen Pettigrew will extend that analysis in the following presentation comparing to the CPS. So just briefly, a comparison of the two polls. ABC News poll is produced for ABC News by Gary Langer of Langer Research and Associates with field work, sampling data collection by Apt Associates. Both of the surveys use probability sampling, but there are some other differences in methodology in terms of mode, the population represented, the weighting. There's some similarities in the weighting in terms of the variables used, but as I think has been mentioned, the exit poll also weights to the vote, our best estimate of the vote, and the ABC Post poll does not do that. And then also there's some minor differences in question wording as well in some of the questions I'll be looking at. So in terms of comparing the two, this slide just looks at the overall horse race number for the national House vote. You can see they line up pretty closely here, but and also again just to point out the exit poll results here are the final national exit poll results, which are weighted to the truth. All right, and in terms of the marginals for the demographics, comparing the two polls, across a number of variables, the results are quite similar, even given the methodological differences between the polls. And in particular, looking at age and education, you can see quite a close correspondence between the two polls, indicating that the weighting adjustment worked as intended. And as I mentioned, in 2016, when Gary did this analysis, they did not line up quite as well. You can see the percentages for the age groups are quite close. And then for education, those with a college degree, without a college degree, the two key categories we look at, you can see the results there match exactly. This slide shows the same comparison, this time looking at political opinion questions, economy. Again, the results are similar. The exit poll does have slightly more people identifying as both Democrats or Republicans than the ABC post poll, and I think that's likely due to a difference in the question wording, but also due to a difference in timing in that the exit poll obviously is asked right after people vote, so people might be more likely to self-identify with a party after they vote. This slide compares the percent Democratic vote in each of these subgroups, again for the two polls. Close correspondence. I mean, if you look at the two lower age categories, it looks like there might be a little bit of a difference there, but the sample sizes in the ABC post poll are very small, so these are not statistically significant differences in any of the groups on this page. And then this shows the same thing for the opinion questions. Again, similar results between the two polls. The only one comparison on this page is statistically significantly different, and that is for people who approve of Trump. 4%, the estimate there among Trump, people who approve of Donald Trump, 4% voted Democratic in that group in the phone poll, in the pre-election poll, and then it was 11% in the exit poll. But again, even in this case, from a practical standpoint, the conclusion one would draw from the data is not significantly different there, even though the results are statistically different. So bottom line there, even given the methodological differences between these two probability sample polls, the results are consistent across the two surveys, but notably, for what I'm talking about here, quite consistent for age and education, showing the efficacy of the weighting adjustment for 2018. And like I said, Stephen will talk a little more about that as well. So the comparisons I just showed are looking at the final exit poll data after it's been weighted to the actual vote right after Election Day. So the next thing I want to do is look at the effectiveness of the weighting on Election Day. So this chart shows the 5 o'clock, again, this is for the national exit poll. This shows the 5 o'clock data release of the national exit poll compared to the final exit poll results. So 5 o'clock is the time where we can start first reporting the exit poll results on Election Day. It's only partial data at this point. It's most of wave one. So that represents only about a third of all respondents that we'll end up getting. But even in that case, you can see the results line up pretty well here, or very well. The chart, so this is the chart for the marginals, which means the size of group estimates, the percent women, percent college educated, the percent who approve of Trump. That's what this is estimating. This is for all variables on the national exit poll in all response categories. And so it compares the results, like I said, at 5 o'clock with the final results, and you can see very close correspondence. The average difference between the two was half a percentage point across all these variables and categories, and all the differences were 2 points or less. This chart does the same comparison, but looking at the percent Democratic vote within each of these subgroups, so the percent Democratic vote among women, among Trump supporters, that kind of thing. And the average here at this point between 5 o'clock and the final was about 1 percentage point difference between the estimates, and 93% of all the estimates were 2 points or less. So overall, these two graphs show that the 5 o'clock estimates were very good, and that the new weighting was effective starting with the first release of data at 5 o'clock. And then the last thing I looked at was the impact of the new weighting on exit poll trend. To answer the question, again, giving the new weighting approach, what does it mean for trend? Is it still possible to do trend comparisons to past exit poll data? So we did this by looking at the 2014 and 2016 national exit polls and comparing the results using the new weighting with the results using the original weighting. So the next two charts look at the size of group estimates for both years. So this is 2016. This is setting aside the age and education variables that were used in the weighting. Obviously, the impact on those variables was larger because we weighted to those variables, but this represents all the other variables and all the other categories. You can see there was minimal change from the original weighting to the new weighting. The average difference for the size of group marginals here, other than age and education, was just under half a percentage point, and 100% of all the differences were 2 percentage points or less. And then you can see in this graph, for 2014, the results were almost identical, minimal differences between the two weightings. The next is the same analysis, but looking at the percent Democratic vote in each of the subgroups. And this is for 2016. This is for all variables. This includes all the age and education response categories as well. And so here are two minimal differences between the original weighting and the new weighting. The average difference was half a percentage point. 99.6 of all differences were 2 percentage points or less. And this is the same graph for 2016. Again, minimal differences there. So my conclusions, first of all, the new weighting approach for 2018 was quite successful. It improved the representation of age and education in the exit poll. The new weighting was effective starting at 5 o'clock p.m., which is the initial data release and the time at which we first start talking about the exit poll on Election Day on air. And then finally, what does the new weighting mean for exit poll trend? There was a minimal impact of the new weighting on the size of group marginals, like I said, except for age and education. And there was a minimal impact on the subgroups, the vote by subgroup for all variables, including age and education, meaning that it is possible to use the previous exit poll data as trend for pretty much everything except for the age and education marginals. Thank you.
Thank you. I tell you, these are 5 people who know how to work in a deadline. We're ahead of schedule, folks. And for the folks in the back, we do have quite a number of seats in the first and second row, if you'd like to have a seat. Okay, up next we have Stephen Pettigrew, who's going to present more about the weighting of the exit poll. Stephen is Associate Director of Data Sciences at the Penn Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies.
Thank you. Let's see. Great. So I'm Stephen Pettigrew. In addition to my responsibilities at Penn, I also work on the NBC News decision desk as well. And I'm going to be talking for a few minutes a little bit more in depth about what we did with the education weighting, building on what Dan just talked about. So just to start and just to sort of ground things, so one of the challenges that's a little bit different from what the exit poll is trying to accomplish versus many other pre-election polling that goes on is that there's a need for the results to be sort of immediate, right? We're working for a media organization where they want to be able to talk about the composition of the electorate right at 5 o'clock. They want to have a good answer of who is voting on that day in real time. And so while we have really good ways to estimate or to adjust samples using voter validation, those sorts of things that are applied in the CPS or the American National Election Study or the CCES, those aren't really feasible to do in real time because we don't have the voter file data to do that until weeks or months later. And so the exit poll, fortunately, what I'm going to show is that it provides results that are consistent with those high quality studies that come out months later, but it does that even before the polls close. Another problem that faces a lot of polling, and this has been touched on by a couple of the presentations, is that we know that in survey research that people will misrepresent whether or not they voted. So voter validation can fix this after the fact, but again, that's not until a long time after election night, at which point, the people on air have already talked about everything that happened on election night. And so exit polling is great because we know that the people that we're polling actually just physically left the voting place, and we know that they cast a ballot. And then lastly, another challenge is that a lot of polling faces is that we don't know the composition of the electorate before election day. That's what we're actually trying to explain. And so the exit poll mitigates this problem by weighting the survey based on decline requests to fill out the survey. And so we've talked a bit about this, but I'll get into that a bit more. So as we've mentioned, before 2018, the exit poll, it was weighted to attributes that are physically observable by the survey enumerator. So if the survey enumerator asks somebody to fill out the poll and that person declines, the enumerator records their age, their race, and their gender so that we can go back and weight to that decline. The challenge, though, is that we know that in the past couple years, education has become this bigger cleavage that affects politics. And so by not weighting to education prior to 2018, the exit poll and lots of other polling out there, it tended to have too few non-college graduates and thus potentially too few Republican or Trump voters. And so just to highlight that a little bit with data to show you what this actually looked like in the exit poll before 2018, this graph shows the estimate of the percentage of voters who had a high school diploma or less. And so the black dot with the bars here, that represents the estimate that came out of the American National Election Study, again, one of these high-quality studies that comes out several months after Election Day. And the purple dot here, this is the pre-2018 weighting scheme. This is under the old weighting scheme, how we were doing on this education question. And so you can see we were about 10 points too low from what the ANES said. And again, the ANES, it was largely consistent with what the CPS and other studies show. And so we were about 10 points too low. And then on the flip side, when you look at the folks who had a bachelor's degree or more, we were about 10 points too high in the exit poll. And so this is the problem. This is sort of just grounds the problem of what we were trying to solve with our new approach. So the problem, though, is that under our weighting scheme that we had used prior to 2018, we were weighting to things that were physically observable. So we were, in a very direct and accurate way, we were able to know the attributes of the folks who were not replying to our polls. Obviously, though, you can't just look at somebody. It's much more difficult to look at somebody and know what their level of education is just by sight. So then the question becomes, how do we account for education without sacrificing the biggest advantages that we have to the exit poll and without sacrificing the things that we know that we're doing well? So our solution then is this two-pronged approach. So we don't abandon what we know works well, where we continue weighting to non-responses on age, gender, race, and in that way, we don't have to make any assumptions about the composition of the electorate. We can actually use real data, right? We don't need to have a likely voter model. We don't need to have any sort of models of people's race, that sort of thing. We know because we've physically seen what their attributes are. And so the key new piece that we added in 2018 is that we added to the weighting process a way to account for education. And so we're using past data on turnout probability by education to do this. And just to be a little bit more detailed, so we had constructed these adjustment ratios of the educational composition of the electorate based on past CPS data. And we separate the education variable into two categories. We have the folks who have no bachelor's degree and then the folks who have a bachelor's degree or more. And we actually interact that with race, because what we've seen, what's clear with a lot of the research that's been out there, is that this cleavage on education is largely pronounced among white voters. That folks who are non-white, there doesn't tend to be as sharp of distinctions between people with a bachelor's degree and people without a bachelor's degree. But we see that among white voters, so we do these adjustments using the interaction between age and race to get it right. So we did a lot of research and we did a lot of back testing before 2018 to figure out and to make sure that this was going to work well. So to show some of those results, so going back to the graph we just showed, so this is again the proportion of voters who have a high school diploma or less, and you can see that the old weighting scheme, the purple dots there, and there are actually confidence intervals there, probably a little bit hard to see, but they're kind of narrow because we have such a big sample size. You can see though that we're about 10 points lower in the old weighting scheme. If we go back and do this back testing, and now these green dots, these show what our estimates are under the new weighting scheme for 2008, 2012, and 2016. And so what you can see is that we've gone from being about 10 points too low on this group to being consistent with what so this is the ANES, but I could also show the CPS, the CCES, other estimates of these studies that come out well after Election Day, and we're consistent with those. We can look at other groups. So this is the proportion of voters who have some college but no bachelor's degree. And you can actually see in this group, we were doing pretty well before we changed the weighting scheme here. And again, we're still doing pretty well, right? These are largely consistent with what other studies show. And then, importantly, the proportion of folks who have a bachelor's degree or more, whereas we were about 10 points higher than what other studies showed in the pre-2018 weighting scheme. With our new weighting scheme, where we're doing this education adjustment, now we're in line. We're right in line with what other studies show from those years. And most importantly, it's important that we've changed this with regard to education, but it actually hasn't changed our estimates from some of the other demographics. So this is our estimate of the proportion of voters who are women. And you can see that before we made this new adjustment, we were doing really well with this group because we're able to weight directly to that physical observable trait. And so we can weight to non-response in that way. And with the new adjustment, we're still right in line with what other studies have shown. It's similar with race. So this is the proportion of voters who are white, non-Hispanic. You can also see the proportion of voters who are black, non-Hispanic. And then, of course, the proportion of voters who are Hispanic, right? So we're right in line with where, with what the ANES says. And then similarly, and Dan had mentioned the adjustment we did to age. So you can see here, those age, we've been able to rein in our age a little bit better, a little bit closer. So this is the proportion of voters who are young, people under the age of 30. And here's our estimates of the proportion of voters who are over the age of 60. So you can see we were several points low on those, and the new weighting scheme had brought those up as well. So that's the easy thing, right? Backtesting is a little bit easier when you have the benefit of hindsight and you know what the result's supposed to look like, and you can tune it that way. What's really important is knowing how well it worked in real time before we know what the answer is. So how did it look in 2018 on election night? So this graph shows, and again, I'm not showing the ANES here because those data aren't available, but the CPS, which just came out a few weeks ago, using that as sort of a baseline to show. So these are our estimates of education. And the green dots here, that represents our 5 o'clock estimate of the proportion of people in these 4 education categories, right? So this is not weighted to the final result. This is 5 o'clock. We're not even done interviewing everybody, but this is right when we're about to go on the air with some of these numbers. And you can see that we were, prior to 2018, particularly the high school or less or the bachelor's group, those were about 10 points off of what the CPS ultimately told us. Now we're within a point or two, right? We're telling the story that's a highly accurate story. And similarly, when you look at these other attributes, you can see we're consistent with those as well. So here's gender. We're right in line with the proportion of voters who are men and women, as well as race. So these are the proportion of voters who are white, black, and Hispanic, as well as age. So we're getting the age distribution correct as well. So just to wrap up, so the important takeaway here is that the exit poll does a really good job of painting a picture of the electorate even before polls are closed. While people are still voting, we have a really good idea of what the electorate looks like. And critically, the education weighting, this new weighting scheme that we used in 2018, it provided really high quality estimates of education level of voters, and it did that without sacrificing the really high quality estimates that we already had on these other attributes. And what's really critical is that we're able to do this using contemporaneous data, real data that we're able to observe in these precincts during the time of voting, rather than having to rely on any sort of ex-ante assumptions about what the electorate will look like, without having to use any sort of turnout modeling or any sort of complicated statistical assumptions. We can do it just based on what we have seen with our own eyes, or what our survey enumerators have seen with their own eyes. So that's all I have. Look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. I feel like we're hazing Stephen a little bit, making him sit down there, but it's just a very small stage. But thank you, Stephen. Okay. Let's see. Our final presentation comes from Jen Agiesta and Keating Holland at CNN. Jen is Director of Polling and Election Analysis at CNN.
Good morning. I have to thank my co-author Keating, who couldn't be here for AAPOR this year, but he really developed the data set that enabled this presentation. So what I'm going to be walking through is a little bit of the history of exit polling and some of the long-term trends that are available through exit poll data and not really available by any other source. And it's a valuable source of information on election history in the United States. So the short version of the history of how this goes is major media exit polling began in the 1970s, and there's comparable national data available for every presidential and midterm election going back to 1972, with the exception of 1974. The sponsors and researchers behind these exit polls have changed over time. Started out at CBS News in the 70s, thank you, Murray. And then in the 80s, it was a little bit of a Wild West, where each media organization was conducting their own, and then everybody merged together in the 90s, formed Voter Research and Surveys, which later became Voter News Service, and then today, the major networks still pool together with the National Election Pool. All told, we're looking at a a repository of nearly 50 years worth of research on voters that is methodologically comparable. So across all of these different combinations of sponsors, the methods have been very stable. At its base, most people in this room probably know this, but just in case you don't, we select a random sample of precincts. Within those precincts, a random sample of voters is interviewed, and those results are tabulated and ultimately weighted, as has been described in other presentations, so that the top line vote estimates match the final vote outcomes, and it allows us to look at how voters in different subgroups behaved and thought. There have been some small changes over time. Most of them have not interrupted trend. We've made small changes to the question wording. We've made changes to the appearance and the size of the questionnaire that the voter fills out. We've introduced additional weighting for differential non-response by demographics. And we've added interviewing by phone or in person to account for the growing number of early and absentee voters. But through all that change, we're looking at long-term trends that are very stable, that mirror other data. And beyond that, they become the data of record on election night because they are our first look at really who voters are and what they're thinking. And they also allow us to assess the voter makeup and behavior by variables that really aren't available in any other data source. And so I'm going to walk through some of those variables in the next few slides. So the first trend that I want to look at is our long-term trend on ideology. This is the only question in the entire exit poll that has not had a question wording change since 1972. It's been exactly the same the whole time. So this is our nice, clean trend. It's just beautiful. So as you can see on this slide, the blue line is the share of liberal voters, the green line is moderates, and the yellows are conservatives. As you can see, the number of moderates has been sort of long-term declining, and the number of liberal voters is at a pretty high point. Conservatives have also been increasing, but a little bit less, it seems, than liberals. And this is significant because when you look at how these groups voted, polarization between liberals and conservatives is massively larger than it was when exit polling began back in the 70s. So what this slide is showing you, the blue bar is the Democratic margin among liberals in House votes in each election year. The red bar is the Republican margin among conservatives, self-identified conservatives, in each election year. And the last 5 election cycles have just had the largest polarization that we've seen at any point going back to the early 70s. This is our long-term trend on the gender makeup of the electorate. As you can see, it's mostly female at this point and has been consistently that way for quite some time. By race and ethnicity, these mirror the changes that we're seeing overall in the American population. The share of white voters has declined, the share of non-white voters is increasing, and when you look at that green and yellow line, the share of Hispanic voters is now equal to the share of black voters. When you break that down further by gender, you can see in the red line at the bottom of the screen that non-white women are starting to outpace non-white men, and that's contributing to that growth of non-white voters. Religious affiliation is one of those variables where we don't have another good data source for this. The census can't ask about it on the CPS. It's not something that you can easily attach to a voter file, and even if you did, you probably can't go back to the 70s. These are our long-term trends on religious affiliation. What's most notable and what's been reported elsewhere is that the share of religious nuns has increased pretty dramatically, and it's increasing more sharply in recent years. You had the GSS this year reporting that as a share of all adults, religious people without a religious affiliation are now as large a group as evangelicals. And in our data, they're actually now the same size as white Catholics. That's the dark green line there. This is sort of an interesting thing. White Catholics have long been thought of as one of those bellwether groups in presidential election years. That's no longer really the case. We can look back through exit polling history and see how they voted in presidential years. The numbers along the top are the share of the popular vote that each winning presidential candidate received. Below that is the Democratic and Republican vote among white Catholics. As you can see, going through Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, the Catholic vote for these candidates pretty much mirrored the overall share of the vote that that candidate received. Starting in the George W. Bush years, that changed, and it hasn't turned back. This is now a solidly Republican group, and we know that because of exit polls. I also wanted to touch on our long-term trends on partisanship. This is one of those slides where things bounce around a little bit. And as I think Dan mentioned, party ID in an exit poll is a little bit different than party ID in a phone poll. What you don't see on this slide is the increase in independence that we've seen in typical phone polling. People who vote and then fill out an exit poll seem to be more likely to affiliate themselves with a party right after they've chosen a candidate who belongs to that party. And I think it's an important bit of exit polling trend that should be pointed out. So looking ahead to 2020, we can look back at the Democratic electorate over the course of the previous primaries because of all of the exit poll data that we have. What is obviously clear from those data are that Democratic primary voters are becoming rapidly diverse, and they're becoming diverse at a greater rate than the population overall. The data that I'm going to present here are from an analysis that I worked on with Ron Brownstein. You should go read his article, it's really good. And it shows that this incredibly diverse field of Democratic candidates is going to be sorted out by the most diverse Democratic electorate that we've had. And one example, I should explain source of data before I move on. On the next few slides, the numbers that you'll see, overall share of Democratic electorate for 2016 and 2008. These are combining all of the exit polls that were conducted during the primary season in each of those years. As you can see, the list of states is a little bit different from 2008 to 2016. But what I want to highlight is the states in red are the ones that were not included in both data sets. And if you look at the states in red in 2008, it includes most notably California, which the inclusion of California would lead to an even greater exacerbation, I think, of the trends that I'm going to show you on the diversifying electorate. California voted super late in 2008. In 2016, they voted pretty early in 2008. They're going to vote pretty early again in 2020. So one example of this is if you look at the gender makeup of the electorate. So on the far left of your screen, that's the overall male-female composition in 2008 versus 2016. That's pretty similar. But it is worth noting that the Democratic electorate is majority female by quite a large margin. In the second set of numbers, you're looking at the share of white versus non-white voters within each gender. And for men, it stays about the same. But you can see that growth of non-white women that I pointed out earlier among the overall electorate, it's bigger here among Democrats. And again, on the far right, that's gender and education combined. So you can see college-educated, not white, college-educated women are growing as a share of the electorate more than any other group when you break it down that way. That's pretty meaningful. The college white women, who are sort of a meaningful share of the electorate, they voted 55-43 for Hillary Clinton, whereas college white men voted 55-43 for Sanders. But those college white women make up a larger share of the electorate. So looking ahead to 2020, some of the subgroups that are going to be a bit of a focus. When you combine race, education, and gender, the largest subset of the Democratic electorate is white college-educated women. They made up about 21% of the electorate in our data in 2016. Black women, regardless of their education level, made up about 15% of Democratic voters. That's as large a group as college-educated white men or as of whites who are very liberal. Looking at party by gender, the largest slice of the Democratic electorate is self-identified Democratic women. They make up almost half of Democratic primary voters. And the next largest subset is Democratic men, and that's a pretty steep drop between those two groups, 46% to 29%. And it is also worth noting that a significant share of the Democratic electorate is older. We talk a lot about younger voters and where they're going to go in the primaries, but 60% of Democratic voters in 2016 were age 45 or older. And looking at the partisan and ideological makeup of these voters, This is a group of self-identified Democrats. 75% of Democratic voters are self-identified Democrats. That kind of makes sense, but it's important to remember when we focus on differences between Democrats and independents from pre-election polling. Ideologically, only about a quarter of voters in 2016 in the Democratic primaries considered themselves to be very liberal. So the focus on progressive policies, if there are vote differences between very liberal voters and others, you could see a difference there. In 2016, Clinton won each of those ideological subsets except for the very liberal. And I want to dig into one specific state as well, just pretty briefly. So New Hampshire is one of those states that is often a pollster's nightmare, but thankfully we get exit poll data, and that helps to tell us what happened. There are 4 possible scenarios that you could see in 2020, and there are exit poll models for each of those scenarios when you go back in time. So if you look at 1984, if we see a scenario where our frontrunner stumbles, the 1984 exit poll would be a good comparison point. Gary Hart won most major groups. He split registered Dems. He lost seniors to Mondale. The frontrunner could recover in 2008 following a disaster in Iowa. You saw that in 2008, where Hillary Clinton narrowly edged out Barack Obama among liberals, among moderates. Her win rested on registered Democratic voters, women, and older voters. We could wind up with a face-off between Massachusetts and Vermont. In 2004, we had exactly that scenario. Massachusetts took the win that time around, though there was an even split among liberals and among voters under 30, who are groups that, as I've noted, we talk about a lot. And finally, in 1976, we saw what I'm calling the crowded house primary. There were double-digit number of candidates, and New Hampshire picked the winner. They knew that everybody else would not win. Carter emerged victorious from a large field. His win was built on the strength of moderates, independents, and older voters. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So, John asked me to provide some discussant remarks, which I'm very happy to do. In the interest of transparency, I should mention that for about 10 days every other year, I do exit poll analysis for the NBC team. That said, I was not involved at all in any of the research that you saw presented, so I'm happy to offer some reactions. I'll start with what I think is the most important takeaway. So as Jen detailed, the National Exit Poll has existed in one form or another for over 40 years. The stakes are incredibly high, the scrutiny is intense. It's not a trivial thing to make some real changes to its methodology. And by the way, get 4 national news outlets to agree to it. So I'll be honest, the improvements and the innovations that we saw presented today, I think are tremendous. For people like us who come to AAPOR, the whole point is reducing error, right? And I think that there was a lot of compelling evidence across these presentations that you succeeded last year. You made the national exit poll more accurate. So, job well done, guys. If I was wise, I'd just sit down. But I am interested in the question of whether there's still more work to do, whether even more improvement in the exit poll is possible. So, for example, the new calibration protocol is certainly and perhaps appropriately restrained. By that I mean it's very focused on subgroups where all election-related polls, certainly not just this one, but all election-related polls are hampered by differential non-response. So the 2018 calibration was a 3-category age adjustment and a white, non-white by college grad, non-college grad adjustment. Now, I'd be interested in your thoughts as to how you arrived at that adjustment versus a different path you could have taken, which would be a more elaborate set of calibration adjustments. So, for example, right, there's the possibility of breaking out Hispanics or breaking out non-Hispanic blacks in the race adjustment. There's the possibility of breaking out high school or less in the education adjustment, and it goes on and on. But somewhere you have to draw that line. And as we know, as election pollsters, you do have the challenge of not having population targets, at least not precise ones for the election that you're in. So in that context, I think that there is something to be said for being pretty restrained here, but I'd still love to hear some elaboration about how you drew those lines, where you drew them with the new protocol. Another aspect that I'm fascinated by is the weighting on the interviewer observation data for age, gender, and race. Now, admittedly, that wasn't really a focus of any of these presentations, but I think this is, a broader discussion about how the exit poll is weighted, what the possibilities are, and so to me it felt like it was in the mix. Obviously, the virtue of using the interviewer observations is that they do reflect the profile of people who are actually voting in the current election, whereas a CPS-reliant calibration assumes that this election looks a lot like recent elections, which we know is not always the case, and 2020 could look very different from 2016. But I've always been curious about this particular adjustment for two reasons. Number one, anytime we have interviewers guessing things, right, there's going to be some measurement error. And number two, if the non-covered voters, so for example, absentee voters, if they're demographically different from the people who are covered and voting on election day, then those election day interviewer-based adjustments might not work as comprehensively as we'd want. So I can't help but wonder, what if you did like the thought experiment and you dropped that interviewer observation-based adjustment altogether and replaced it with a more comprehensive adjustment using past CPS data? Now, I don't know if that would work any better, and there's probably some 1980 memo from Warren Matofsky, like talking about how awesome the interviewer observation adjustment is and how much work it's doing in the weighting. But I've just never seen that, and just kind of curious. So I'd love to know if that's something you guys have looked into or know more about. And I want to emphasize here that what you did in 2018 worked really well. I don't mean to imply here that it's broken, because I don't think that at all. It's just, as a fellow survey weighting nerd, I'm sort of curious as to the marginal benefit of those interviewer-based adjustments over what you can do with the calibration. For the Edison paper, there were two things that jumped out to me. First, that the two states had such different rules with respect to the distance that the field data collectors had to be from the polling place, 10 feet in Tennessee versus 100 feet in Nevada. And while this obviously wasn't like a randomized controlled trial, it didn't seem like that mattered at all. It didn't seem to really affect the performance of the poll in the state. So just wondering if you had thoughts on that. The other question I had was about interviewers managing both an iPad or iPads, I wasn't sure how many they had, versus paper ballots, kind of at the same time. It was a little surprising to me to see that the majority response is still with paper. And I'm sure the iPads aren't cheap, but I wonder, like, if you gave the interviewers more iPads, would that help things? Would it hurt things? Would it make it too cumbersome? Might it reduce the amount of manual coding that they have to do? Any more you have to say on that issue would be very interesting. On the precinct level weighting adjustment that Josh talked about, that's very exciting to me. I tend to be in favor of weighting on anything useful that you can get your hands on, and it makes total sense to me that you'd explore using precinct level votes. So I very much look forward to seeing how you develop that more, Josh. And then in the ABC and CNN presentations, those were both very well done. To me, they both underscore the strong performance of the election poll in 2018. Those were both pretty straightforward. So with that, again, I'd say job well done, and turn it over to you in case you have some reactions.
So the first thing I would...
Here, let me give you this, John. Testing.
Yeah, I can just stand up if you want me to. Okay, so thank you, Courtney. Those are useful suggestions. The reason why we asked Courtney to sort of discuss basically remarks is because First of all, we think she has one of the best minds in the business on these sorts of things, and I think a lot of you in the audience would agree on that. And in addition, we're not done innovating. Right? So this is like when I had talked about some of the things that we're going to be doing. We're forming working groups. We're drawing on a ton of academics. Obviously, the people here on the stage also. Some of the suggestions that you would, the thing when you talked about this sort of interviewer-based, if we drop the interviewer-based sort of adjustment, there's no reason why we couldn't do it both ways and just see, right? So we are continually looking at everything to make sure that we have the best product out there. And we welcome, this is a collective effort. If you think this small group up here can sort of accomplish this is a huge thing that we face just as a collective. And so I don't know if others have things, but again, thank you very much. And we can get into, we want to leave enough room for questions, but did anybody else have any direct responses to Courtney's stuff?
Yeah, I can see. Is this working? Testing. I'm going to have to get out just because so people on the video can see. Yeah, so thank you, Courtney, very much for your thoughtful comments. In terms of the weighting, and if people want to get into more details, Joe can speak up as well. So, changing the weighting in this way was kind of a big deal. And as someone mentioned, to get a whole committee to agree is not easy. Now, certainly our committee is 4 people. It used to be larger. And so it's a little easier now to do it, but it's still, it's still a lot of back and forth. So in terms of the new weighting adjustments, certainly something more fine-tuned, is something we'll look at. But in terms of the stability of the ratios, we found in the groups that we looked at that they were quite stable, and so we felt that they would, be good improvements. So we'd have to look at the stability of those ratios in those groups as well. In terms of the age, race, sex non-adjustment for the interviewers, this is something Murray Edelman and I did a lot of research on years ago when I worked for Murray in the 1990s. And we found that the interviewer estimates were very good. Very, very good for sex and for race. Good for age. Not as good for age, but good enough to be an improvement in the estimates. And so certainly we found that it's an imperfect adjustment, given that we've had to add another age adjustment. One reason we're keeping that adjustment, or we've kept it so far, is that we still need to run that adjustment to do the old weighting and to be able to, we need that for the new weighting. But in any case, it's certainly something we can look at teasing out. Joe?
In terms of the in-person early voter exit poll, one of the benefits of these early voting centers is they're pretty large. So the distance our interviewer had to stand away from the polling place is early voting center is not as critical in these early voting centers, just because the traffic is so much larger and the parking places are usually further away and whatever. When the polling places get smaller, a difference between 10 feet from the polling place and 100 feet from the polling place makes a lot of difference on election day. But in these bigger early voting centers, they tended not to make as much difference. I think that's one of the issues there. In terms of the iPads, it is a balance. You're balancing a lot of things. You're balancing cost. The other thing you're balancing is security. What you really don't want is if there's multiple iPads, an interviewer having to keep track of multiple iPads and having a voter take an iPad and just walk off with it, and then you're done for the rest of the day in terms of using that equipment. So that's why we limited it to one now. We can probably experiment with doing more. And in terms of the balance between paper and iPad, there's 2 things going on there. One is because we only had 1 unit at most places. When that unit was occupied, paper was the only option for the next person coming out of the polling place. But we still saw, and we have the statistics on this, a measurement of by age how people use the equipment. And as you would expect, older people were much more likely to use the paper, and younger people were much more likely to choose the iPad. So we have those stats as well. So there's both a factor of the availability of the iPad, but also a difference in terms of age and other demographics in terms of people choosing which method to fill out the survey.
All right, so we're happy to open up for questions from the audience. And for those of you who joined us via the live streaming, thanks for joining us. There is a mechanism for you to submit questions, and they'll get relayed to us if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about the education weighting. So over the years, people have become more and more college educated, where the numbers have increased. the proportion or the you know, if it had any impact on the age of the sample versus when it wasn't weighted. So we know that, you know, older voters tend to, you know, be more likely to vote. So I'm wondering if it had an impact on older voters.
Here, this is.
Since the way we looked at the past history and comparing the CPS and other national surveys to the exit poll, and that growth that you mentioned in college educated was lined up very consistently. It was just at a different level in the exit poll previously to the CPS and other surveys. So the adjustment we're making is not finding a target for education. It's basically applying a ratio to account for non-response by education and age. So all those patterns remain consistent, and I think Dan shows in his work through the crosstabs that the crosstabs remain very consistent. It's just we're taking a baseline that accounts for a differential non-response and applying a non-response adjustment to deal with that. But we still show the increasing in college education if you take the same trend line that you see in the CPS.
One more thing. I mean, just to add to that, along the same lines that you're saying, certainly age and education are correlated with each other, but we know age and education are also correlated with the vote. So what we do know is by improving age and education, we're also improving our vote estimates, which is one of the most important things.
Yes, sir, over there.
Given jet lag Californians are asking, but how do you account for time zones on those 5 o'clock or in your language 2 o'clock poll estimates?
Yeah, the 5 o'clock is an Eastern time zone quarantine of the data, and that was a decision made by the news organizations after the 2004 election that no data would be released outside the quarantine to even members of the news organizations at that time. So that's a 5 p.m. Eastern time zone, so it is a 2 p.m. Eastern time zone. So in the states on the West Coast, we typically only have, as Dan said, one wave of one of the 3 election day waves of data. In most of the Eastern and Central time zone states, we have 2 of our 3 waves of data in. That tends to be balanced out because the West Coast or the Western states tend to have a higher proportion of early voting. And so those early voters are already included in our surveys, either by the telephone survey or in the case of Nevada with the in-person early voter poll we did. So if you account for the early voting plus the 1 wave of West Coast voting and the 2 waves of Central and Eastern voting, you're talking about 2/3 to 70% of the votes cast are included in those estimates, whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast at that time. So I know it might not be completely fair to our West Coast friends that they only have 1 wave of the 3 election day waves in, but because so much of the early vote is incorporated at that point, it's usually about 2/3 to 3/4 of the actual expected vote is incorporated at that point.
But you know, when I did the exit polling for the LA Times, we had almost 2 waves in because we start at 7, that's when it starts, so that's 10 o'clock your time, and then the second wave can come in around 3 or 4, so you would have partial second wave of California. I mean, because we looked at our data also at around 5 o'clock our time, California time, to get all of the second wave in throughout the country.
Yeah, you had an advantage, Susan, because you were able to time it just for your state. We're timing all 50 states to come in as well. Yeah.
That's why we looked at it at 5. But what I was saying, when we had 2 exit polls, which is great, because we could commiserate together to see what our numbers were and whether we were off base or whatever. But I have a question about, I really like the pre-election polling on the absentee, but like in California, for instance, we have a really long absentee voter time, and I think they're going to try in 2020 to do more central locations, but for the most part, it's mail-in ballots. do the early voting, how would you do that, number one? And number two, when you get to the central location to do the early voting, it shows that some people vote earlier are different than the people that vote later. And so how do you decide when you're going to do your early voting? Because if you do it, let's say, at the end, I mean, for instance, we would do telephone interviewing of the early interviewing and end on Monday before the Tuesday of the election. So we would get a cross-section of people voting. But if you're stationary on one particular finite time, you might miss out on a different kind of voter.
Right.
So how would you adjust to that?
Well, we did in Nevada and Tennessee adjust for that. We had 20 locations, and we had 2 shifts per location, and we randomized their assignment through the full 10 or 14-day period. So we had roughly the same number of interviewers in place Monday, 2 weeks out, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then also we assigned it by the hour, so we were covering all the hours. Because you are correct, Susan, that you typically early voters tend to be older and a little more Republican. Later early voters in person tend to be younger and a little more Democratic. So to account for that difference, we randomly assign the hours across. To go back to your first question, in terms of this technique may not work in states like California and definitely mail-only states like Washington and Oregon and Colorado, but we think there's a lot of promise in states like Nevada and Tennessee where the vast majority of early voting is in person. There's other states that have that, and one of the things we might want to discuss is in states like Florida, where there's roughly an equal number of by mail early voting and in-person early voting, whether we want to do some sort of mixed mode for the early voting, so do some in-person for the interviewing for the in-person exit polling and continue the telephone survey of the by mail voting. Good. We haven't done a mixed mode because there is a cost effect. The main benefit of this approach was it was both cost effective and we knew we were talking to early voters, but it is limited to states where the vast majority of early voting is done in person.
Yes, sir, over there.
So what do you make of the fact that at the precinct level, Democrats seem to do better in the unweighted exit poll data than they do in the actual results?
So I think that's just, that's something we've seen in pretty much a lot of surveys, right? I mean, the weighted data that people are willing to kind of, answer the survey, they're different, right? There's non-response issues, and, why Democrats are more likely to to talk about how they voted, in the exit poll. I don't have a good theory about Democratic versus Republican voters, but I think the important thing is that if insofar as you can find that there is that difference that does exist, right, can you then kind of correct for it and account for it? I think that's where the exit poll precincts are, right? So it is the fact that when you talk to people, there does seem to be a little bit of, Democratic bias at the precinct level, right? But that's knowable, and that's historically, been the trend. And so then, given that, we can adjust, from that accordingly, because we know if we're talking to too many Democrats and we're not enough Republicans, and we know how those precincts compare precinct by precinct, right? Then we can kind of figure out, all right, we need to kind of figure out how to adjust that so we have the proper representation of kind of partisanship in the particular district.
You're adjusting that based on demographics, not in any kind of partisan, anything correlated directly to partisan.
Well, there's 2 steps there. I mean, what you were saying was what we were showing there was the completely unweighted precinct. Once you adjust for the age non-response and the college education non-response, a lot of that snaps away. And then the final part is, as Josh said, taken care of when you get the actual precinct by precinct results.
Yeah, Sir Don.
How much of that adjustment in terms of the Democratic skew to their responses gets taken care of by the demographic weightings that you're doing?
By the what?
The demographic weightings and the education that you've added this year and the age, race, sex that you've added.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at all those factors. We looked at, we have estimates that account for the education adjustment and how much that moved. We also had estimators. We were looking at past history of overstatement by precinct based on the demographics of the precinct, and as we said, the demographics of the interviewers. And we know the interviewer demographics can affect the response rate by precinct. So we in essence had a bunch of different models in which we would triangulate what our 5 o'clock estimates would be based on both accounting for the demographics and the regression model we had for the interaction between the interviewer demographics and the precinct demographics. And between all those estimates, we were, as you could see, able to get at 5 o'clock estimates that were, on the most part, within 1.5% at the time.
Transparency, are you going to share which of those 3 vectors, how much each of those 3 vectors affected the number?
Well, the graph I put did not weight to top line results. So that was just demographic adjustments, right? So the final 2 slides of the presentation that compared the final certified vote to the 5 o'clock vote estimates, that was not weighting the top line. That was just based on the non-response adjustment based on education, race, and gender.
That's what you just asked for. It's right there in that slide, and so we put it up here. AAPOR has it. It's all up there.
And just to expand on that, I mean, in terms of your question, so the age and education adjustment does improve things. It certainly doesn't get us all the way there, but it's a real improvement. But also a new adjustment or a new estimator for 2018 is some great work that Clint Stevenson did. He's sitting next to you there. He might be able to talk to you about that. But he's he's the chief statistician at Edison, and he's come up with a new estimator that specifically estimates the within precinct error to get at the Democratic overstatement or any kind of overstatement. And so he looked at hundreds of variables, and he came up with a model for 2018. I believe it's like 18 variables that was very effective. There were a few states where it didn't work quite as well, but he's been able to identify the reasons for that. So we think it'll be even improved for 2020.
All right, yeah, we've reached our end time. Thank you all for coming. Some of the presenters can hopefully stick around for a little bit for more questions.